I watched the way he looked at my property records, not like a man curious about his wife's family, like a man taking inventory. My name doesn't matter much for this story. What matters is that I spent 41 years building something real. I worked pipelines in West Texas in my 30s, saved every dollar I could, and when the work dried up, I moved my family to a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, where land was still cheap, and a man with calluses on his hands could make something of himself. My wife, Lorraine, God rest her. She believed in me even when the bank didn't. We bought 12 acres out on Cutter's Ridge Road in 1987. Paid $32,000 for it. Lorraine planted a vegetable garden that first spring. I built a fence. We raised our daughter there. Her name is June. She was born in that house, technically. We almost didn't make it to the hospital in time. She grew up running barefoot across those 12 acres, catching fireflies in mason jars, falling asleep on the porch swing while I read the paper. She was my whole world after Lorraine passed. Pancreatic cancer 2019. Fast and brutal. June and I held each other in that hospital parking garage, and we both knew that from that point on. It was just the two of us. I should have paid more attention to how grief changes people. June met a man named Prescott at a work event in downtown Knoxville about 8 months after we buried her mother. He was handsome in the way that men who know they're handsome tend to be, a little too aware of the room, a little too easy with compliments. He sold financial consulting services, which as far as I could tell meant he helped people with money find ways to give some of it to him. The first time she brought him home for dinner, he spent 45 minutes telling me about his investment philosophy and never once asked me a single question about my life. I noticed. I didn't say anything. June was lonely. I understood that. Grief does something to a person's need for closeness. It makes you reach for the nearest warm thing. Prescott was warm in all the surface ways. He texted her constantly, sent flowers to her office, showed up at her door with takeout when she had a long day. I watched my daughter light up in a way she hadn't since before her mother got sick, and I kept my mouth shut because I knew that if I pushed, she would pull away. What I did instead was start paying attention. I am 67 years old. I've seen enough men in my life to know the difference between a man who loves a woman and a man who loves what a woman represents. Prescott looked at June the right way when she was watching. When she wasn't, his eyes wandered. To his phone, to the window, to some middle distance where, I suspect, he was running calculations. 6 months after they started dating, he proposed. June called me crying, the happy kind, and I told her I was thrilled because that's what a father does. Then I hung up the phone, sat down at my kitchen table, and began to think very carefully about the 12 acres on Cutter's Ridge Road. Here's something I never told June. The land had been appraised the previous year as part of some county reassessment. The value had come back at $460,000. 12 acres butting up against a parcel that a regional developer had been quietly buying around for the better part of 2 years. I had received 2 letters, actual paper letters, asking if I'd be interested in selling. I had not responded. I wasn't interested in selling. That land was where Lorraine's garden used to be. That land was where June caught fireflies. But Prescott didn't know any of that, and I decided, very deliberately, that he wasn't going to find out from me. I had a cousin named Alvin. We went to high school together, lost touch for 20 years, found each other again at a family reunion in 2011. Alvin had become a paralegal and then, late in life, an actual attorney. Small practice, wills, and estates mostly, the kind of office that still had a physical filing cabinet. I called Alvin 3 weeks before June's wedding and told him what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a moment. "You think this guy's trouble?" he said. "I think this guy sees dollar signs when he looks at my daughter," I said, "and I'd rather be wrong and prepared than right and helpless." Alvin drew up a new deed structure. The property went into a trust, a specific type called a revocable living trust, with me as the sole trustee during my lifetime, and June as the sole beneficiary upon my death, with one condition: the trust asset could not be transferred, liquidated, or leveraged by any spouse or cohabitant without a unanimous decision from a 3-person advisory panel that I appointed. 2 of those people were Alvin and my neighbor Ray Dutton, a retired county sheriff who had known me for 20 years. We filed the paperwork quietly. I did not mention it to June. I did not mention it at the rehearsal dinner, or the wedding, or at the reception where Prescott shook my hand and called me Dad for the first time, and I smiled and said, "Welcome to the family." The wedding was in October. By January, I was seeing the first signs. It started small. Prescott began asking questions at family dinners, offhand questions, the kind that don't sound like questions if you're not listening for them. How long had I owned the property? Had I ever thought about downsizing? Was the upkeep getting to be too much at my age? I answered each one plainly. Long time. No, I'm fine. He would nod and change the subject. Then June stopped coming to Sunday dinners alone. Prescott was always there now, which was fine. He was her husband. But the dynamic shifted. June would start a sentence and Prescott would finish it. She'd reference something from her childhood and he'd steer the conversation somewhere else. Once, she brought up Lorraine, just a small memory, something about her mother's pie crust recipe. And Prescott said, very gently, "Babe, we've talked about dwelling." June went quiet. I had to put my fork down and look at my plate for a moment. By spring, June was calling less. Not dramatically. Not the kind of sudden silence that makes a parent panic. Just a gradual thinning. The way a river slows before a dam. When we did talk, she sounded careful. Like she was editing herself before the words came out. I started writing things down. I bought a plain spiral notebook at the Dollar General, and I kept it in my truck, not in the house. I noted dates, statements, behavioral changes. The Sunday she didn't come at all, and the excuse didn't arrive until Tuesday. At the time, Prescott answered her phone when I called and said she was indisposed. The evening she came by alone, unexpectedly, and I could see from the way she held herself, shoulders in, arms crossed over her chest, that she'd been crying recently. I didn't pepper her with questions. I made her tea and I let her sit on the porch and I waited. "He just gets frustrated sometimes," she said finally. "Frustrated how?" I asked. She shook her head. "It's nothing. He's under a lot of pressure. His business isn't doing great." I nodded like I accepted that. Inside, I heard every alarm I owned go off at once. A man whose business isn't doing great, married to a woman whose father owns nearly $500,000 in land and who is getting frustrated. I had seen enough. I called Alvin the next morning and told him to make sure every piece of paperwork was airtight. "It is," he said, "but you know she could still choose to fight it after you're gone." "I know," I said. "I'm not worried about after I'm gone. I'm worried about right now." What I didn't tell Alvin was that I had already taken one additional step. About 2 months earlier, I had hired a man named George, a former Knox County investigator, who now did private work to run a basic background check on Prescott. Not because I expected to find something dramatic, because I wanted to know what I was dealing with. George called me on a Thursday afternoon. He found 2 things. The first was a civil judgment from 2016 in Georgia. A woman, a former girlfriend, had sued Prescott for fraud relating to a joint investment account he had drained before ending the relationship. She had won. He had paid a partial settlement, and the rest had apparently never been collected. The second was a name. Prescott had been briefly married before, a marriage that lasted 14 months and ended in a divorce that his ex-wife's attorney had characterized in court filings as financial abandonment. She had been left with joint debt and a lease in her name for an apartment Prescott had already vacated. He had done this before, twice that George could find. I sat with that information for 3 weeks. I thought about calling June immediately. I thought about driving over there and laying it all out on the kitchen table. I ran that conversation in my head 100 times, and every version of it ended the same way. June, defensive, protecting the man she had chosen, reading my concern as control. Prescott, calm and prepared, reframing my evidence as the desperate interference of a lonely old man who couldn't let his daughter go. I had to wait. I had to let him make his move first. It came in August. I was on my porch on a Saturday morning, coffee, newspaper, the way I like to start a day, when my phone rang. It was Lou Peterman, who owned the storage barn I rented on the edge of my property to keep my equipment. Lou was a man of very few words, and the words he used that morning were careful and clipped. "Your son-in-law's out here," he said. "He's got a truck, and he's got a fellow with him who's carrying what looks like a bolt cutter." I set my coffee down very slowly. "Lo," I said, "don't let them touch anything. I'm on my way." I called Alvin first while I drove. He told me exactly what I needed to know because the property was in trust. Any attempted forced entry or removal of assets could be treated as civil trespass and potentially theft, depending on what they took. He told me to document everything and not to confront physically. Then I called Ray Dutton. Ray was at the property before I was. When I pulled up, Prescott was standing beside a rented pickup truck, and his companion, I later found out it was a buddy of his from Atlanta, not any kind of official, was holding the bolt cutters at his side like he'd been told to wait. Prescott had a piece of paper in his hand, which he held up when he saw me, like that meant something. "This is a copy of your property tax record," he said. I had someone pull it. "The land appraised at $460. June is your only heir. We've been talking to an attorney about." "Put that down," I said. He kept talking. Something about marital estate rights, something about how, as June's husband, he had standing too. "Prescott," I said, and I said it quietly, the way I'd learned to talk to men who were used to filling rooms with noise. "That storage barn is on property held in a revocable trust. I am the trustee. You have no standing here. You never had any standing here. You never had any standing here. And the man standing behind you is a retired county sheriff, who I called before I left my house this morning." Ray raised one hand, just slightly. The color left Prescott's face in a way I don't think he could have faked. "The bolt cutter your friend is holding," I continued, "constitutes preparation for breaking and entering. The fact that you drove here in a rented truck suggests intent to remove property. I have your text messages to my daughter asking about the land value. I have testimony from Lou here about what you said when you arrived, and I have an attorney on the phone right now." I held at my cell. Alvin said calmly, "This call is being recorded." Prescott said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," I said. "Get off my property, and when you get home, tell my daughter to call me. It's time she and I had a real conversation." He left. His friend dropped the bolt cutters on the ground, actually dropped them, just set them down and walked away, and they drove off in that rented truck. I stood there in the August heat for a minute, just breathing. Lou put a hand on my shoulder. "You've been ready for that for a while, haven't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "About 18 months, I said. June called me that evening. She had clearly been crying, but it was a different kind of crying, not the held-in, careful kind I'd been hearing for months. This was relief, mixed with shame, mixed with something that sounded like the beginning of anger, aimed in the right direction. I told her everything. The judgment in Georgia, the prior marriage, what George had found, and when. I told her I had waited because I knew she had to see it herself, and that I was sorry it took this long, and that none of it was her fault. She was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me about the land?" she asked. "The trust, the value, any of it." "Because I didn't want money to be part of our relationship," I said. "The land is yours when I'm gone. That was always true. I just didn't want it to be the reason someone chose you." She cried again. I let her. The divorce took 8 months. Prescott contested it briefly on grounds that were vague enough that his own attorney eventually talked him out of pursuing it. The prior civil judgment in Georgia surfaced in discovery, which made things move faster. He left Knoxville and, as far as I know, went back to Atlanta. June moved back to the area about a year later. Not back into my house. She's not a kid, and I raised her to be independent. But she found a rental about 4 miles down the road. We have Sunday dinners again. She brings the pie. I make the coffee. Sometimes we sit on the porch after and watch the light change across the ridge. The same ridge she ran across barefoot as a little girl. I still have the notebook I kept in my truck, the spiral one from the Dollar General. I thought about throwing it away once everything was settled, but I didn't. I keep it in the drawer of my nightstand now. Not because I'm bitter. I'm not. I keep it because it reminds me that loving someone sometimes means watching quietly, preparing carefully, and trusting that the truth will eventually need a place to land. I made sure I had that place ready. Lorraine would have done the same thing. She was the patient one, always. I learned it from her. I still have that Dollar General notebook, 79 cents, spiral bound, college ruled. I thought about what it means that a 79-cent notebook ended up being the most important document in the whole situation. More than the trust papers, more than George's report, more than anything Prescott brought to that property in a rented truck. What I wrote in it wasn't complicated. Dates, times, things June said and didn't say. The way her voice sounded on a Tuesday versus a Sunday. It wasn't legal evidence, not really. It was just a father paying attention, but paying attention, done consistently and without panic, has a way of becoming its own kind of power. I've been thinking a lot about what actually happened here. Not the legal part, not the dramatic part with Ray standing there and Prescott going pale, but the underneath of it. Prescott was a man who had learned to take shortcuts around other people's trust. He did it in Georgia. He did it in that first marriage. He came to Tennessee and he did it again, and the reason he kept doing it was that it kept working. Nobody had ever been ready. Nobody had ever been ready. Nobody had ever been watching long enough, quietly enough, carefully enough to catch him mid-step. I was, and the reason I was came down to something my father taught me without ever saying it out loud, that the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing, and a man who can't tell the difference will eventually pay for the confusion. I could have confronted Prescott at that first dinner. I could have called June the week George gave me his report and unloaded everything I knew. It would have felt righteous in the moment. It would have blown up in my face within a week. What I did instead was harder. I had to wash my daughter in pain and not rush in. I had to sit with information that made me angry and stay calm anyway. I had to trust that the truth had weight, and that if I gave it time and ground to stand on, it would eventually hold. That's not patience in the easy sense, the kind where you just wait and hope. That's patience that requires you to keep thinking clearly when everything in you wants to react. It requires you to know the difference between a moment that calls for action and a moment that calls for preparation. June asked me once, after everything settled, how I knew to set out the trust when I did. I told her I didn't know anything for certain. I just knew that love without a plan is sometimes not enough, that protecting someone you care about means thinking 3 steps ahead, especially when they can't see the board clearly themselves. She carried herself differently after it was over, straighter. Like something that had been pressing on her shoulders had finally been lifted. She started finishing her own sentences again. Started bringing up her mother without catching herself. I noticed all of it, the same way I had noticed the slow disappearance of those things in the first place. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this, if they're in a similar place. Not the legal strategy, not the specific steps, just the idea that quiet integrity compounds over time. The choices you make when no one is watching, the records you keep, the patience you practice, the willingness to do the slow right thing instead of the fast, satisfying one. Those things accumulate. They build into something solid, and when the moment comes that actually requires you to stand your ground, you're not scrambling. You're ready. You've been ready. You just had to wait for them to show up with the bolt cutters.